At 4:30 in the morning, Lena woke up to screaming in the hallway. And her Mafia husband handed her a gun. Not flowers, not comfort, a gun. Then he looked her dead in the eyes and said, "If someone comes through that door, don't negotiate, shoot." That was the moment Lena understood the truth. She was never locked inside that mansion to be controlled. She was locked inside because outside those walls, someone was already trying to kill her.
Heels. Case notes on subject Lena Park, age 23. She is observed in the office of a high-value target, presenting not with supplication but with the intent to negotiate her own capitulation. The inciting stressors are significant. Heels. A $3 million debt and a non-traditional proposal. The terms involve a contractual marriage to a 70-year-old organized crime figure for the sole purpose of procreation. Initial assessment indicates high resilience. Heels. Subject Park's defiant posture suggests a predisposition for oppositional behavior, a trait that could prove volatile within a controlled, high-pressure environment. The office itself is an assertion of power, with olfactory indicators of wealth. Heels. Lena Park is positioned in a chair whose value far exceeds her socioeconomic reality, maintaining a rigid, controlled posture. Heels. At 23 years of age, she has already internalized posture as a somatic locus of control in the face of systemic loss. Across the desk, Victor Castelli, the antagonist, employs calculated silence, a 4-minute duration. Heels. Meticulously tracked by the subject as a tool of psychological dominance. His reported age of 70 seems incongruous with his physical presentation. While signs of aging are present, they are described as carved. Heels. Suggesting a history of disciplined stress rather than organic decline. He projects an aura of immovability. His first vocalization is a flat, factual assertion of power delivered without effect. "Your mother," Heels, "owes my organization $3.2 million. Subject Lena displays no discernible startle response. Heels. The subject's foreknowledge of the specific debt amount demonstrates a full cognitive acceptance of her circumstances. The root cause is noted as a maternal pathological gambling addiction, Heels, which has compounded the initial liability to its current state. Lena's response, "I'm aware," is concise, indicating emotional regulation. Victor's gaze, described as pale and colorless, Heels, is reported to induce a physiological reaction of unease, a common response to a predatory focus. He methodically states the impossibilities of repayment. Her counteroffer, not in cash, Heels, represents a critical shift from passive victimhood to active negotiation. This appears to trigger a micro-expression of what could be interpreted as amusement in Victor, a rare crack in his disciplined facade. Heels. Castelli now initiates a strategy of systematic devaluation. He verbalizes a summary of her financial data: a $42,000 annual salary, $1,700 in savings, $12,000 in student loans. Heels. This is a textbook tactic designed to reduce an individual's self-worth to a numerical value, thereby establishing psychological dominance. The subject exhibits a somatic response, a clenched jaw, confirming the verbal assault's impact. However, Heels, she counters this dehumanization with a logical challenge. "And yet, you agreed to meet with me." Victor concedes the point before revealing his motivation. Her mother's plea, and more importantly, Heels, his own pressing problem requiring a very specific solution. Heels. He produces a file containing photographic documentation. The images depict Victor in various contexts: a funeral, a corporate meeting, a wedding, all showcasing a consistent lack of emotional expression. The key intelligence is then delivered. Heels. His father, the current head of the Castelli organization, is terminally ill with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. His prognosis is 6 months or fewer. Victor's vocal tone remains flat, detached, even when discussing his father's impending death. Heels. The succession of power, he explains, is contingent on a rather archaic and ruthless condition set by the patriarch. Heels. The decree stipulates that leadership will pass to the first of his children to produce a legitimate heir. This places Victor in direct competition with his 3 married siblings, one of whom is already well into a pregnancy. Heels. The subject immediately processes the variables with chilling accuracy. "You need a wife," Lena states. Victor's correction is precise, stripping the term of any relational meaning. "I need an heir." When she questions the consequences of refusal, Heels, Victor outlines a scenario of total financial and social obliteration, a threat designed to eliminate any alternative but compliance. Heels. In response to her query about acceptance, the terms are presented as a clinical transaction. She would marry him, cohabitate, and perform spousal duties until conception and delivery of a healthy child. Upon fulfillment, Heals, her mother's debt would be nullified, and she would receive a $5 million settlement and a legal separation. Freedom. The subject's mind fixates on her mother's liberation, a year, perhaps less, of her own life in exchange. Heals. Her gaze returns to the photographs. The smiling woman in the wedding dress prompts a question about his last wife. "I've never been married," he states. The woman, he clarifies, was part of another business arrangement. Heals. The subject's smile was performative. Victor's hands rest on the desk as he delivers his ultimatum. 48 hours to decide. A wedding in 3 days. A legally binding contract detailing every facet of the arrangement. Lena's throat tightens. Heals. "I have conditions." Victor's eyebrow, a minute gesture of surprise, rises. "You're not in a position to negotiate then. You're not desperate enough." Lena maintains eye contact, leveraging her assessment of his situation. "You could marry anyone," Heals. "But you're here talking to me because everyone who knows you knows this is about succession, not love." Heals. "They'd expect a prenup. I'm nobody." She correctly identifies her primary value, her disposability. Her anonymity makes her the perfect, uncomplicated vessel for his ambition. She then presents her terms. Heals. Her voice steady despite clear physiological signs of fear. "My mother goes to the best rehab facility in the state. You pay for it. Furthermore, she demands a safe, untouchable residence for her mother post-treatment." He agrees without hesitation. Heals. "I want my own bank account." He offers access. She refuses. Heals. Lena rejects his offer of access and demands an autonomous account in her name, with $10,000 deposited monthly, under her sole control. A flicker of resistance crosses Victor's face before he gives a single, sharp nod of agreement. Heals. Her final condition: "When I give you your heir, I disappear. No contact. You let me go." He confirms this was always the plan. "I need to hear you say it." In response, Victor leans forward, establishing dominance through posture and direct eye contact. Heals. "When you fulfill your obligations, Lena Park, you will be free. I will not look for you. I will not follow you." Heals. "You will leave my life as completely as you entered it. You have my word." The word of a sociopathic personality, underwritten by a capacity for extreme violence. Lena rises, her motor control slightly compromised, but her voice remains stable. Heals. "I'll have an answer in 48 hours. "You already know your answer," he counters. He is correct. The decision was made out of necessity before she entered the room. "I need time to think. You need time to lie to yourself." Victor also stands. Heals, his physical presence dominating the space. He accurately diagnoses her need for a window of perceived choice, a psychological buffer, and grants the inconsequential request. Heals. Lena's nails create pressure points in her palms, a self-soothing gesture. "You're a real bastard, you know that?" His affirmation is immediate. Yes. Victor closes the distance between them, his proximity a tactical assertion of physical power. Heals. He is taller, broader than anticipated, a man whose physical form has been weaponized. "But I'm an honest one," he says, reframing his psychopathy as a virtue. "This is a transaction. You give me an heir, I give you freedom. Everything else is theater." Heals. She raises her chin, a gesture of defiance. "Good, because I don't love you either. Then we understand each other. Perfectly." He produces a card. Heals. "My personal number. Call when you've made your decision." Lena accepts the card. A brief moment of physical contact reveals his skin is warm, contrary to her expectation. She asks for clarification on one final point. Heals. The public performance of their arrangement. Victor's expression shifts, displaying something darker than a smile. "It means you'll play the role of a devoted wife, convince the world that this marriage is real. My enemies will look for weakness." Heals. "You cannot give them any." "And in private?" she asks. "In private, you're free to hate me as much as you want." Heals. Lena pockets the card and moves to the exit. As her hand touches the door, Victor speaks her name again. She turns back. "If you say yes," he states in a lower register, "there's no changing your mind. No running. Once you're mine." Heals. "You're mine until the contract is fulfilled. Do you understand?" The subject's pulse accelerates, a clear sign of an acute stress response in her throat. "I understand." "Good." She exits into a sterile hallway of marble and calculated lighting. Heals. The presence of 2 guards near the elevator confirms the controlled nature of the environment. She enters the elevator, and the closing doors symbolize the beginning of her confinement. Heals. The initial manifestation of the subject's trauma response occurred only in isolation, following the removal of the immediate threat. Post-event adrenaline collapse is noted. 47 hours later, the subject, Lena, initiated contact with the principal, Victor, who responded with immediacy, indicating anticipation. His query is a classic control tactic, forcing a binary choice and removing nuance. The subject's environment, described as a gray life, suggests a pre-existing state of depression or hopelessness, making her more susceptible to drastic intervention. Her affirmative response triggered the next phase of psychological conditioning, The principal's terms were absolute, bring nothing. This serves to strip the subject of her identity. Her request to see her mother, a plea for a final connection to her old life, was denied. This is a deliberate isolation tactic, The principal framed the mother's rehabilitation not as a kindness, but as a commodity to be earned, thereby linking obedience directly to her mother's well-being. This reframing establishes a powerful leverage point. The subject's hostile reaction was met with disconnection, another assertion of control. Lena's subsequent physical outburst, throwing the phone, is a common expression of powerlessness. Seeking sensory input from the cold glass suggests an attempt to ground herself in a moment of extreme psychological distress. She had entered into a binding arrangement with a man 30 years her mother's senior, a figure whose entire operational framework, violence, power, secrecy, is antithetical to societal norms. The point of no return had been established. The transport vehicle, a black Mercedes with opaque windows, functioned as a mobile isolation chamber, furthering the subject's disorientation. It arrived with military precision at exactly 900 hours. Lena was waiting, her attire, the best she owned, an attempt to retain some semblance of dignity in a situation where she had none. The driver's silence reinforced the impersonal, transactional nature of the event. Inside, the new leather and cologne were sensory markers of a world of wealth and power she was entering but did not belong to. The principal, Victor, initially withheld all acknowledgement, a tactic to establish dominance and render her insignificant. His physical distance across the car mirrored the psychological chasm between them. The prolonged silence, lasting 10 minutes, was a test of her composure. Lena's attempt to break it with sarcasm, "Are you always this chatty?" was a predictable, albeit futile, act of resistance. His response was a dismissal of her attempt at connection. To her query about their destination, he replied, "City Hall," clinically framing the union as a purely bureaucratic process. "This isn't a celebration, Lena. It's a legal formality." This statement is designed to strip the event of any emotional significance, reinforcing the power imbalance. He then produced the contract, a 40-page document filled with dense legal terminology. This is a form of intimidation, overwhelming the subject with information she cannot reasonably process under duress. The first clauses she identified were concerning her physical liberty. "This says I can't leave the property without your permission." His confirmation was blunt. The duration was stated, 1 year or until impregnation. Lena correctly identified this as a form of house arrest. Victor reframed it as protecting my investment, dehumanizing her to the level of a chattel. He introduced the threat of external enemies, a classic manipulation to justify isolation and foster dependency. Her question of refusal was met with a veiled threat about breach of contract, leveraging her mother's situation against her. The contract proceeded to stipulate a shared bedroom. Victor's justification, "Appearances matter," reveals a core narcissistic trait, obsession with external perception. He clarified his earlier promise, stating that while her internal state was her own, her physical proximity was not. The logic presented was cold. Separate rooms would lead to staff gossip, which could be weaponized by his siblings. The principal's argument was structured to appear logical, masking its true purpose: total control over her personal space. Whether or not anything happens there is irrelevant. Lena's physiological response, flushing, indicated acute emotional distress and humiliation. The document's final page detailed the financial transaction: $5 million, her mother's debt nullified upon the birth of a child, and clean separation terms. This is the core of the exchange, her body for her mother's freedom and financial security. She requested a pen. His directive to sign only after the ceremony was a final assertion of his control over the proceedings. The vehicle stopped. City Hall appeared as a monument to bureaucratic apathy, a fitting venue for this transaction. The subject observed other couples, a stark contrast that would amplify her own sense of alienation and the abnormality of her situation. Victor offered his hand, a performative gesture of traditional courtship. Her acceptance, though hesitant, signified her capitulation. His grip is noted as firm, steady, a physical manifestation of his unyielding control. The ceremony itself was perfunctory, lasting 12 minutes, conducted by an indifferent clerk, Victor's vows were delivered with clinical precision. Lena's I do was audibly shaken, a vocal marker of her internal conflict, There was no celebration, merely a legal congratulations. Next, the finality of the act was brutal. The subject, now Lena Castell, reported feeling maximum social isolation. The estate, located an hour from the city, was a veritable fortress, designed for isolation and defense. The passage through 3 security checkpoints served to psychologically impress upon her the completeness of her confinement. She perceived the main building not as a house, but as a fortress, an accurate assessment of its function in Victor's world. The driver opened her door, a final act of service before she was handed over. The air itself felt different, a sensory indicator of her removal from her former reality. Victor led her into a foyer designed to intimidate with its scale and opulence. A staff member, Mrs. Kozlov, appeared. Her severe appearance and crisp tone established her as an enforcer of the principal's rigid order. Victor's instructions were curt, referring to Lena as my wife, but then immediately delegating her care, treating her as an object to be managed. Lena's interjection, "I don't have things," was a final weak protest against the erasure of her identity. Victor's reply, "Then see that she has things," demonstrated his absolute power to create her new reality from nothing. He provided a single instruction, "Dinner is at 7, don't be late," and then abandoned her. This abrupt departure is calculated to induce feelings of disorientation and dependency on the household staff. Mrs. Kozlov's use of the new surname, Mrs. Castell, further cemented the subject's new unwanted identity. The route to her room was deliberately labyrinthine, enhancing her sense of being lost and powerless. Mrs. Kozlov stopped at the master bedroom. The room was immense, but decorated in a monochrome palette, reflected the principal's apparent lack of emotional warmth. It was a space of cold, perfect elegance. Mrs. Kozlov outlined the layout, noting the connected dressing rooms and bathroom, a design enforcing proximity. She stated that clothing would be provided, completing the process of stripping Lena of her past. When Lena questioned the room's ownership, the confirmation was blunt. This was his room, her room, a shared space. Mrs. Kozlov's expression remained impassive, a trait likely selected for by her employer. The subject's acceptance was faint, indicating resignation. The final instructions for dinner were given. Mrs. Kozlov then offered what she termed advice, which was in fact a threat outlining the principal's core values. Punctuality and discretion. It was a warning against disobedience and curiosity. Upon being left alone, Lena was forced to confront the totality of the contract she had entered into, a psychological cage as real as the physical one. The arrival of clothing was executed with silent, depersonalized efficiency. The sheer volume and value of the items, dresses, shoes, jewelry, were intended to overwhelm and in-depth the subject, a classic golden cage tactic. The items were designer labels, brands associated with a status and lifestyle entirely alien to her. She randomly selected a black silk dress, an object representing her transformation. This triggered a moment of cognitive dissonance as she contrasted her life from just 2 days prior. An accountant in Queens, with her current reality. She now possessed material wealth beyond measure, but was the property of a man she feared. Looking out the window, she observed the garden's perfect, controlled state, seeing it as a metaphor for her new existence. A prison made of beauty. The physical act of pressing her head to the glass is a recurring, self-soothing behavior. At 6:55, a knock signified the next phase of her structured life. Lena had complied with the unspoken command to adorn herself in her new uniform, barely recognizing the woman who now reflected her captivity in the mirror. Observation initiated. Subject Lena Castelli opens the door to an escort, a male in nondescript attire. Her initial verbal resistance, "I can find it myself," is immediately overridden by the assertion of the primary subject's authority. Mr. Castelli insists. This establishes the power dynamic. Lena exhibits compliance, following the escort through a deliberately convoluted path, a standard environmental disorientation tactic. The destination, the dining room, is a study in calculated austerity designed to intimidate. Subject Victor Castelli is positioned at the head of the table, engaged with a personal device, a clear display of dominance by withholding acknowledgement. Feels. Subject Lena responds by creating maximum physical distance, a non-verbal act of opposition. Feels. A period of non-communication follows, a test of wills. Lena initiates contact, a sign of psychological discomfort with the enforced silence. Victor's response. If you prefer conversation, you're welcome to initiate it. Feels. Places the emotional labor squarely on her. Her prodding is met with monosyllabic, dismissive replies, productive till he escalates. His statement, "You're an employee," is a calculated act of psychological aggression. Feels. A reclassification of her status meant to devalue and control. Her physiological response, fists clenching, is noted. A server's arrival is precisely timed. Feels. A controlled interruption preventing further emotional escalation and reasserting environmental dominance. The moment of potential conflict is neutralized. Feels. The subjects consume the meal in silence. The quality of the food is irrelevant. It is a prop in a performance of normalcy. Lena's attempt to exert control by making a demand is predictable. "I want to see my mother." Feels. Victor's denial, "Not yet," is absolute. Her follow-up is an attempt to verify the information he controls. His response is a demonstration of superior intelligence and surveillance capabilities. He recites the exact location, room number, Feels, and admission time for her mother at the Green Hill Recovery Center. This is not reassurance. It is a display of omniscience designed to reinforce her complete dependency and his total control. Feels. He offers to produce admission records, a further display of power. Lena's reaction confirms the efficacy of the tactic. Victor's claim, "I don't lie," Feels, is a common assertion among megalomaniac narcissists who believe their version of events is the only truth. He denies requests for a visit, framing it as a protective measure. "The moment you leave this property, you become a target," Feels. He constructs a narrative of external threat, positioning himself as her sole protector, a key stage in fostering a trauma bond. Her emotional outburst, "I hate you," is met with good. Her emotional distress validates his control. His own statement, Feels, "So do I," is a calculated mirroring, creating a false sense of shared burden. Feels. Victor terminates the interaction on his own terms and leaves. Subject Lena is left in the sterile environment, where the emotional transaction is complete. For the first time, she displays an overt emotional release, crying. Feels. This marks the end of the initial resistance phase. The subsequent week is characterized by a routine of structured isolation. Victor is largely absent. Their shared dinners are ritualistic, with minimal verbal exchange, approximately 10 words. Feels. A physical barrier, a wall of pillows, is established in the shared sleeping quarters, delineating territory. Feels. Lena's coping mechanisms involve exploration, an attempt to map the boundaries of her confinement. She catalogs the library, the gym, and the locked doors that signify the limits of her approved access. Feels. She attempts external verification by calling the rehabilitation center, but Victor's control extends beyond the property line. Patient confidentiality is weaponized to maintain her isolation. Feels. The administrator's denial reinforces her powerlessness. The psychological pressure culminates on the 8th day. Victor returns late, finding her waiting. Feels. Lena verbalizes her distress. "I can't do this." She describes her state as disappearing and suffocating. Victor's initial response is textbook gaslighting, invalidating her experience. "You're adjusting. You're being dramatic." Feels. This triggers a shift in Lena from passive despair to active anger. Her statement, "I'm a person, Victor, not a broodmare," is a direct challenge to his dehumanizing classification of her role. The term triggers a visible reaction in Victor. Feels. His rapid physical approach is an act of intimidation, re-establishing physical dominance. Feels. He offers honesty as a tool of manipulation. He confirms her function to provide an heir, but reframes her confinement not as punishment, but as protection. "I didn't lock you in this house to break you. I locked you in to keep you alive." Feels. This is a critical moment. He is recasting himself from captor to savior. Her request for explanation, her voice cracking, signals her vulnerability and readiness to accept his narrative. His command, "Sit down," is a test of compliance, Feels, which she passes. He moves to the window, a theatrical positioning, before delivering his strategic disclosure. Feels. Victor outlines the familial conflict, painting his siblings as caricatures of dysfunction. Marco, reckless Dominic. A public disgrace. His wife is desperate. Elena, brilliant but pathologically ruthless. Feels. This narrative is constructed to present himself as the only viable leader. He turns back to her, creating a moment of contrived intimacy. All three of them will do whatever it takes. Do you understand what that means? Feels. He leads her to the conclusion he desires. Her stomach knots. They'd hurt me. He escalates. They'd kill you. The room's temperature is a subjective perception of fear. The marriage, he explains, is succession. Feels. He expands the narrative. This is a war he must win to prevent the collapse of his father's empire. He dismisses his siblings as unfit leaders, a fool, a sadist, a brilliant, ruthless alternative. Her challenge, and you are, Feels, is met with a self-aggrandizing, bitter smile. No, but I'm the only option that doesn't end in blood. It's a messianic complex. When she questions why he chose her, an outsider, he clinically dissects her vulnerabilities. You're clean, uncomplicated, Feels. And most importantly, you're desperate enough to agree. He acknowledges her as a tool selected for her lack of complications. Feels. He crouches, creating a false parity in eye level. I'm not a good man, Lena, he confesses, a disarming tactic to feign vulnerability while admitting nothing specific. But I keep my word, Feels. He then makes the captor's classic promise of safety within the confines of captivity. As long as you're my wife, no one will touch you. This is the core of the Stockholm Syndrome inducement, Feels. The $5 million payment and her freedom are conditional, contingent on the birth of a child. The target on her back, he claims, is temporary. Her utility has an expiration date. Feels. Lena's query, what if I can't get pregnant, reveals her internalization of the transactional terms. His response, then we both lose, frames their fates as intertwined. The following morning, a note is left. It is not an apology, but a directive, Feels. An instruction to engage with poetry on the specific subject of entrapment. This is a highly sophisticated manipulation, providing a sanctioned outlet for her feelings, thereby managing her psychological state and ensuring her continued stability. Feels. He is prescribing her own coping mechanism. She complies, spending the day immersing herself in literature that mirrors her confinement. Feels. The prescribed therapy, poetry, proves effective as a multiative measure. Lena establishes a new routine, returning to the library daily. She is sublimating her anxiety into a sanctioned intellectual activity. Feels. She reads authors who articulate the experience of being caged. 3 weeks pass. The overt hostility in their interactions is replaced by a new equilibrium, a silent understanding. Victor queries if she found the collection. Feels. Her one-word confirmation, yes, is sufficient. He has successfully provided a framework for her to endure her captivity. The psychological conditioning is taking hold. Feels. That was the sum of her existence. Staff maneuvered around the subject with a caution typically reserved for fragile objects. A Mrs. Kozlov presented a daily schedule with clinical rigidity. Breakfast at 0800, lunch at 12, Feels. Dinner at 1900 hours. Gardeners outside her window never met her gaze. Security details executed their rotations with militaristic efficiency. Ever present, always silent. The subject, Lena, reported feelings of being an exhibit, Feels. An object to be seen but never engaged with. On day 23, a disruption occurred. She woke to find her perpetrator, Victor, still in bed. She froze, a clear disorientation response. He remained on his side, his breathing even, Feels. This was a deviation from the established pattern. She had never before witnessed him in a state of sleep, as he typically departed before dawn and returned after she had retired, Feels. Observing him in this unguarded state seemed to trigger a sense of transgression in the subject. She exited the bed with maximal stealth, secured clothing, and was proceeding toward the bathroom when his voice intercepted her. It's Saturday. Lena halted, Feels. Victor's eyes were open, observing her. What? Saturday, he repeated. I don't work Saturdays. Oh, she clutched the clothes to her chest, a defensive posture. I didn't know. Now you do. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. Feels. This was the most disheveled she had ever observed him, a calculated performance of near-human vulnerability. Mrs. Kozlov is off on weekends. Kitchen staff will leave breakfast in the warmers. Help yourself. You're not eating? I'll eat later. Feels. Lena exhibited clear hesitation. Feels. Do you want me to leave? She asked. I can go to the library, or this is your room too, Lena. You don't need my permission to exist in it. The statement, ostensibly reassuring, instead served to reinforce the conditional nature of her presence. Feels. She offered a nod and retreated to the bathroom. Upon her emergence 20 minutes later, showered and dressed, Victor was absent. She located him in the gymnasium. Lena had actively avoided this location since her first week, Feels, citing the mirrors and echoing space as environmental stressors. Yet the percussive rhythm of fists on leather drew her to the doorway where she paused. Victor was positioned before a heavy bag, shirtless, clad only in black athletic trousers. Heels. His back was oriented towards her, presenting a topography of violence mapped out in scar tissue. Some lesions were old and faded, others were newer, pink, and raised keloids. He struck the bag with mechanical precision, left, right, heels. There was no extraneous motion, no indecision. Lena understood she should withdraw, that she was intruding on a private ritual, but she appeared fixated on the physical evidence of his past. "You can come in," Victor stated without turning. Heels. "Or you can continue to stand in the hallway. Either way, stop hovering." A physiological heat response was noted in her neck. She entered. "I wasn't hovering. You were." Heels. He struck the bag 3 more times before ceasing the activity and turning to face her. His chest was similarly scarred, a mosaic of old injuries. "See something interesting? I didn't mean to stare." Heels. "Everyone stares the first time." Victor retrieved a towel from a nearby bench, wiping his face. "Knives mostly. Bullets, a 2-1 piece of shrapnel from a car bomb in Prague. Occupational hazards. He uses clinical," Heels. Detached language to describe profound trauma. Selena swallowed a visible sign of distress. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore." "Did it when it happened?" Victor's gaze met hers. "Yes." Heels. The monosyllabic reply was delivered with a weight that suggested trauma beyond the purely physical. Lena broke eye contact first. "I should go." "Why? Because I'm bothering you." "You're not." Victor discarded the towel, moving to a weight bench. Heels. "You've been here almost a month. You've barely left your room except for meals and the library. Such isolation is not conducive to a stable mental state. I didn't realize you cared about my health. I care about functionality." Heels. "A depressed, isolated woman doesn't get pregnant. Basic biology." There it was. The clinical reminder of the contract, the sole purpose for her presence in his controlled environment. Lena's jaw tightened in a classic stress response. "Right." Heels. "Wouldn't want to damage the merchandise." Victor paused, mid-reach for a weight, and straightened. "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" "No." He crossed the space until he was feet from her. Proximity as intimidation. She could detect sweat and soap. Heels. "You want to hate me, Lena? Fine. Hate me. But don't attribute motives to me. I'm practical. There's a difference?" "Yes." "Explain it to me." Victor studied her face, a look of intense analysis, as if solving a problem. Heels. "Cruelty is violence for its own sake, inflicting pain for enjoyment. I don't enjoy this," he gestured vaguely. "Any of it. But I do what's necessary. And what's necessary now is ensuring you don't psychologically deteriorate inside this house." Heels. "So this is what? Charity? This is common sense." Lena produced a sharp, bitter laugh, a textbook displacement behavior. "You've imprisoned me in a mansion, severed my contact with family, and constantly remind me of my singular function." Heels. "And now you express concern for my mental health. That's rich. Would you prefer I feign an emotional investment beyond our agreement?" "I'd prefer honesty. You have it." Victor's vocal tone remained flat, controlled. Heels, a tool of psychological dominance. Heels. "I don't love you. I won't love you. But I am not going to permit you to atrophy, either. So if you need physical exertion, exert yourself. If you need to vocalize distress, do so. If you need to break something, I will provide an object for destruction." Heels. "But do not simply retreat into that library and pretend you're fine." The subject's throat constricted. "Why do you care?" "Because dead-eyed compliance is not conducive to the desired outcome. Of course, the objective remains the contract." Heels. She turned to exit. "Lena." She paused but did not turn back. "There's a pool," Victor said. "Through the east terrace. Heated, private. You won't be disturbed there. Why are you telling me this?" Heels. "Because I surmise you require a space not filled with books or furniture, stimuli that reinforce the reality of your confinement." Heels. Lena finally looked over her shoulder. Victor observed her with an unreadable expression. It was not pity or sympathy. It was closer to recognition, perhaps, as if he understood the psychological pressures of captivity. "Thank you," she said. Heels, her voice low. He gave a single nod and returned to his weights. Lena departed before the interaction could be complicated further. The pool was precisely as he had described. Heated, secluded, Heels, and enclosed by stone walls overgrown with ivy and dormant climbing roses. The water's surface was a perfect mirror for the gray sky. Lena sat on the edge, fully clothed, and submerged her feet. She possessed no swimsuit, Heels, but the simple exposure to open air, not filtered through a window, felt like the first proper respiration in weeks. Heels. She remained there until sunset, until the ambient temperature penetrated her clothing and her feet became numb from the water. Upon re-entering the house, she found a box on her bed. Inside were 3 swimsuits of varied designs, all correctly sized. Heels. There was no note. The gesture left her in a state of conflict, torn between gratitude and a sense of being perpetually monitored. The next stage of interaction began the following Saturday. At breakfast, Victor posed a question. They were in a smaller, Heels, less formal dining room. Lena was deconstructing a croissant. Victor was scanning the financial pages of an unfamiliar paper. "Do you play chess?" he asked, not looking up. Lena showed a startled response. "What? Chess, do you play?" "I know the rules." Heels. "I'm not skilled. Sufficient." Heels. Victor folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Library. 1 hour." "Why?" "Because I find eating in silence tedious, and you are exhibiting clear signs of profound boredom." Lena stared at him. "You want to play chess with me?" Heels. "Unless you have a superior engagement." She did not. 1 hour later, they were positioned opposite each other at a small table near the library windows, an antique marble chess set between them. Victor initiated. Pawn to e4. Lena mirrored his move. Heels. Pawn to e5. They played wordlessly. His style was methodical, calculated, each action deliberate. Lena's approach was defensive, focused on loss aversion. She held out for 18 moves before he achieved checkmate. Heels. Again, Victor commanded, resetting the board. "I told you I'm not good. You are more capable than you assess. You panic." He arranged his pieces. "Don't project 5 moves ahead. Focus on 2. Control the center." Heels. "Protect your queen until the moment of strategic sacrifice." That's dark advice. It is practical advice. They played a second game. This time, she lasted 23 moves. "Better," Victor noted. "I still lost." All subjects lose their initial games. Heels. The diagnostic question is whether you learn from the loss. Lena observed the board, the captured pieces. "Is that what this is? A lesson?" "It is chess. It can be a metaphor." A micro-expression, almost a smile, touched Victor's mouth. Heels. "If you require it to be." A third game commenced. Lena implemented his suggested strategy. Control the center, protect the queen, think only 2 moves ahead. She still lost, but it required 30 moves from him. "You're learning," Victor observed. Heels. "I'm losing slower." The same thing. Lena leaned back. "Why are you doing this?" "Being less hostile." Victor paused for a moment. "Because you were correct. You are not breeding stock." Heels. "And treating you as such is counterproductive to our mutual goal." "So, this is strategy." "Everything is strategy, Lena. The variable is whether the strategy acknowledges your humanity." Heels. She had no immediate response to this piece of high-level manipulation. Heels. Victor stood and began to store the chess pieces. "Same time next week? I have nothing else on my schedule." "Good." He left. Lena remained alone, staring at the empty board, contemplating the true nature of the game being played. Heels. The chess sessions became a fixed routine. Every Saturday for 1 hour, often extending to 2. Lena began to win intermittently, infrequently, but enough that Victor ceased offering rudimentary instruction and began to display genuine concentration. Heels. "You sacrificed your bishop," he remarked during their 7th game. "I needed to open the lane for my rook. A risk, calculated." Victor looked up from the board. An expression akin to pride was briefly visible. "Check." Heels. Lena advanced her king. "Not checkmate. Not yet." 3 moves later, the subject was cornered. "Almost," Victor stated, a form of verbal reinforcement. "Almost doesn't count." Heels. "Almost is how you learn the difference between courage and stupidity." Lena's laughter here is significant, an involuntary release of tension, indicating a momentary lowering of defenses. "Did you seriously just turn a chess game into a life lesson?" Heels. "You're the one who said it was a metaphor." "I was being sarcastic." Sarcasm is wasted on the literal-minded. He resets the board, an immediate reassertion of the training scenario. "Again? Don't you have work to do? It can wait." Heels. The conditioning continued until external stimuli. The change in light, the arrival of Mrs. Kozlov, interrupted the session. Subject note: she had not once thought about the contract, a clear indicator of successful cognitive diversion. Heels. This lack of anxiety should have triggered an alarm response. It did not. On the 43rd day, the environment shifted. Lena was roused by auditory stimuli from the hallway, sharp, urgent vocalizations. Initial disorientation was noted. Heels. Victor's side of the bed was empty. The time was 4:30 a.m. She donned a robe and partially opened the door. Victor was present, fully dressed, engaged with 2 male associates. His vocal tone was low, indicative of controlled aggression. Heels. "How many?" 3 vehicles. They hit the north perimeter checkpoint. 2 guards down, non-fatal. They retreated when backup arrived. Identification? No plates, no faces, professional. Victor's masseter muscle clenched. Heels, a physical tell of extreme stress. Marco or Dominic can't confirm, but the timing. Marco's wife is 32 weeks now. Heels. This information suggests the aggressor is operating under a deadline, increasing their desperation. Double the perimeter. No one in or out without my direct authorization, and get me the security footage. Victor then turned. Heels, registering Lena's presence. His facial expression remained neutral, but his posture tensed. A micro-response. Inside now. The command was absolute. Lena complied. Victor followed, securing the door, effectively isolating the subject. Heels. What's happening? She inquired. Nothing that concerns you. Someone attacked the house. Someone probed our defenses. There's a difference. This is a classic minimization tactic. Victor, get dressed properly. Something you can move in. Heels. His instructions were clipped, efficient. Stay in this room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me or Mrs. Kozlov. Do you understand? A sharp spike in her fear response was observed. Heels. You're scaring me. Good. Fear keeps you alert. Here he reframes her emotional state as a tactical advantage, a form of psychological manipulation. Victor retrieved a small black case. Inside was a handgun. Do you know how to use this? Heels. Lena stared at the weapon, a sign of dissociative shock. No, safety's here. Point, squeeze, don't pull, don't hesitate, and only use it if someone comes through that door who isn't me. He placed the weapon in her hands. The physical sensation, cold, heels. Heavy, grounded her in the new reality. Lena, look at me. She established eye contact. If something happens, Victor continued quietly, if someone gets through, you don't negotiate. You don't reason, you shoot. Do you understand? This is insane. Heels. Do you understand? He repeated, demanding compliance. Yes. Heels. Say it. I shoot. I don't negotiate. This verbal confirmation is a form of behavioral imprinting. Good. Victor grabbed his phone and moved to the door. I'll be back in 3 hours. Maybe less. Don't open this door. He departed. Heels. The subject was left alone, armed, in a state of heightened alert. She locked the door, changed into practical attire, and assumed a waiting position on the bed. The passage of time was distorted, a common symptom of acute stress. Heels. Every auditory stimulus, the house-settling wind, a distant door, triggered a startle response. Heels. She kept the weapon's safety engaged, a logical pass, then two. At the 3-hour mark, a knock. Lena's cardiac response was extreme. Who is it? Victor. She approached the door, exhibiting tremors. How do I know it's you? Heels. A pause, then the challenge response. You told me you hated me the first night we ate dinner together. I said good. You said you meant it. I said so did I. A password rooted in their initial conflict, a foundational element of their trauma bond. Heels. She unlocked the door. Victor's appearance was unchanged, but his eyes displayed a sharp, cold focus. Are you okay? She asked. Fine. He entered, secured the door, and observed the weapon in her hand. Heels. Did you need it? No. Good. He retrieved the gun, securing it in its case. The perimeter's secure. It was a test. They wanted to see how we'd respond. Who's they? Does it matter? Yes. Victor sat. Heels, exhibiting signs of fatigue for the first time in her observation. A calculated display of vulnerability. Marco probably. He's panicking. His wife's due in 8 weeks. He knows he's running out of time. Heels. Lena sat near him, a reduction in interpersonal distance. What happens if his baby comes first? He wins, I lose, and you become a liability. The word is a clinical assessment meant to shock. A liability, she repeated. Heels. You're my wife, the mother of a potential heir. If Marco takes control, he'll need to eliminate any threats to his claim. That includes you and any child you might carry. Lena's visceral reaction was predictable. He'd kill me. He'd try. And you'd what? Heels. Let him? Victor's head turned sharply. No, then what? Then I'd kill him first. The statement was delivered with zero emotional effect, a sociopathic trait. This isn't a game, Lena. This isn't a chess match. This is blood and money and power. So, yes, Heels. If it comes down to Marco or you, I choose you not because I love you, but because you're mine, and I protect what's mine. Heels. This assertion of ownership, which should trigger a fear response, instead registered to the subject as honesty. This is a primary indicator of emergent Stockholm syndrome. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Heels. Not in my world. Victor stood, shifting the focus. Get some sleep. We have a dinner to attend tomorrow night. The sudden change protocol is a disorientation tactic. What? A dinner? My father's hosting. Family only. You're expected. Heels. You said I couldn't leave the property. This isn't leaving. This is walking into a room full of people who want you dead and pretending you belong there. Victor removed his shirt, a casual display of dominance. Heels. Wear something elegant. Smile, hold my hand, play the part, and whatever you do, don't let them see you're terrified. I'm not terrified, he assessed her accurately. Yes, you are, and that's smart. But tomorrow night you can't show it. Tomorrow night, Heels, you are Mrs. Victor Castell, untouchable, confident, completely in love with your husband. His mouth twisted, a micro-expression of contempt. Think you can manage that? Lena's pulse rate accelerated. Do I have a choice? No. Then I'll manage. Heels. His gaze held hers, a final nonverbal assertion of control. Then he disappeared. Lena remained, exhibiting tremors, preparing for a performance for which she had received no script. Heels. The prop arrived the following afternoon. Lena opened the bag. The dress emerald green silk was designed for maximum visual impact. A handwritten note from Victor was attached. Green makes you look dangerous. Wear the diamonds. V. Heels. The directive was clear. She was to project threat. The diamonds were accessories to this performance. Mrs. Kozlov conducted the preparation with clinical detachment, transforming Lena into the required persona. You'll do, she stated. Heels. A functional assessment. At 6 o'clock, Victor arrived. He wore a black suit, an archetypal display of power. Heels. He looked like money and violence wrapped in expensive fabric. His eyes scanned her, a quick appraising glance. Good. That's it? Good? Would you prefer I lie and say you look beautiful? I'd prefer you act like a human being with basic social skills. Heels. Victor's mouth twitched. You look beautiful. The dress is perfect. The diamonds suit you. Better. Barely, he offered his arm. Ready? No. Yes. This internal monologue demonstrates severe cognitive dissonance. Heels. They descended to the waiting vehicle. Once inside, the enclosed space increased the psychological proximity. Rules, Victor began as the car departed the estate. Heels. I'm listening. Don't contradict me. Don't leave my side. Don't engage with my siblings unless they speak to you first. And don't, under any circumstances, accept food or drink from anyone except the servers. Heels. This last rule highlights the paranoid ideation common in his world. You think they'd poison me? I think they do whatever gives them an advantage. This is insane. This is my family. Victor adjusted his cuffs, a self-soothing gesture. When we arrive, Heels, I'll introduce you to my father first. He's old school, traditional. Shake his hand, don't kiss his cheek. Call him Mr. Castelli. What if he asks me questions? Answer honestly. He respects directness. Heels. Even if the direct answer is that I married you for money? Victor's gaze was sharp. Heels. Especially then. The remainder of the drive was silent. The Castelli family estate was engineered to intimidate, making Victor's own residence appear modest. Sprawling over what appeared to be 50 acres, it was a monument to dynastic power. Heels. The vehicle stopped. Victor exited first, offering his hand, a gesture of control, not courtesy. Lena accepted, and together they entered the hostile environment. The foyer was a cathedral of wealth, designed to overwhelm the senses. Marble, gold, Heels, chandeliers, all tools of psychological dominance. The scale forced Lena to tilt her head back, a physical posture of submission. Heels. Observation began upon entry. The environment was saturated with surveillance. Staff assumed static, formal positions along the periphery, while security personnel, thinly veiled as guests, controlled all points of egress. The central figure, Heels, exerting gravitational authority without a physical throne, was an elderly male identified as Victor's father. Salvatore Castelli, at 83, presented with advanced senescence, frail, gaunt, Heels, his integument loose upon a delicate skeletal frame. His eyes, however, betrayed no such decay. They were sharp, assessing, predatory. The eyes of an individual who has arbitrated the fates of organizations. Heels. Victor's hand constricted around Lena's, a stimulus of warning or an attempt at regulation. The subject's interpretation remained unclear. Heels. They traversed the foyer, their approach clinically observed by Salvatore. He offered no vocal or facial encouragement. Father, Victor began upon arrival. This is my wife, Lena. Lena initiated a standard social protocol by extending her hand. Heels. The grip Salvatore returned was inconsistent with his physical presentation, remarkably firm for a man in his condition. His initial assessment. So you're the girl. A classic devaluing statement. Lena's correction. I'm a woman. Heels. Actually induced a state of sudden rigidity in Victor. Salvatore's pupils dilated slightly before he produced a dry, rasping vocalization interpreted as laughter. Victor said you had spine. I didn't believe him. He disengaged his hand. Heels. How much did he pay you? The room became acoustically inert. Lena became the focal point of collective scrutiny, a calculated stress test. She had the option to prevaricate. Heels. She could perform indignation, feigning a non-transactional bond. Victor, however, had briefed her that his father valued directness. He cleared a $3.2 million debt, Lena stated calmly. Heels. Placed my mother in the state's top rehabilitation facility and has promised $5 million upon completion. A sudden intake of breath was audible from her left. Lena maintained forward focus. Salvatore's smile broadened. Honest, a desirable trait, Heels. He redirected his attention to Victor. She will require it. Your siblings exhibit predatory circling behavior, an accurate assessment. Marco's wife is 6 weeks along, I am aware, and you are here, Heels, exhibiting a partner half your age in a union of known convenience. Salvatore's vocal tone lowered. You are losing, Victor. Heels. Not yet. The margin refocused on Lena. Do you comprehend the scenario you have entered, girl? It is a conflict state, Lena replied. For succession, the victor acquires all assets, and if Victor is defeated, Heels, then I become a liability requiring neutralization. Salvatore laughed again with greater intensity. You disclosed the truth to her. I did not assess you as possessing such capacity. He struck Victor's shoulder. Heels. Perhaps you are not as compromised as I believed. Victor's masseter muscle tensed, but he remained silent. Dinner is in the East Wing, Salvatore announced. Attempt to survive until dessert. He departed, Heels, his weight supported by a cane that had previously escaped Lena's notice. The moment he was out of range, Victor leaned into her personal space. Heels. What was that? You indicated he respects directness. I did not advise broadcasting our entire contractual arrangement to the room. The arrangement is already common knowledge. You confirmed this yourself. Lena kept her voice at a low volume. Heels. To pretend otherwise would present me as unintelligent. This strategy establishes that I am not laboring under a delusion. Victor examined her facial cues. Then, an anomalous event. He smiled. A micro-expression, barely perceptible. Heels. You are either demonstrating extreme bravery or profound foolishness. Is it not possible to be both? In this family system, it is mandatory. A female voice interrupted the exchange. Victor, how lovely to see you. They turned. Heels. The approaching woman's beauty was weaponized. Mid-40s, immaculate grooming, a smile that did not engage the orbicularis oculi muscles. Her movements were predatory. Heels. Graceful, calculated. Alina, Victor's tone was flat, his sister. Alina's gaze performed a rapid assessment of Lena. And this must be the child bride. How quaint. Lena observed Victor's physiological stress response but vocalized before he could. Heels. Lena Castelli, a pleasure to meet you. I'm sure it is. Alina's smile became more pronounced. Tell me, dear, what is the subjective experience of being a walking incubator? It must be terribly romantic. Heels. Approximately as romantic as marrying for strategic power, Lena countered. But we all engage in cost-benefit analysis. Elena's eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. Or narcissistic injury. Victor, you have acquired a clever one. Heels. A pity that cleverness will be of no tactical use when Marco's heir is delivered first. Marco is a low-functioning individual, Victor stated. His offspring will be raised by surrogates and clinicians. Heels. Superior to being raised by a father incapable of forming attachment. Elena's smile became overtly hostile. Ah, but that was your own developmental experience, wasn't it? What were the outcomes of that experiment? Heels. The tension between them was palpable. Lena squeezed Victor's hand, feeling the tremors of his suppressed agitation. We should locate our seats, she said, de-escalating. Elena laughed. Yes, run along. One wouldn't want to disrupt the schedule. Heels. She moved closer. A piece of advice, sweetheart. Monitor your food intake tonight. One never knows what contaminants might be introduced. She then disengaged, gliding toward another social cluster. I have a strong negative reaction to her. Heels. Lena stated. Join the queue. They proceeded to the dining hall. Heels. The scale was immense. A table for 30, crystal, silver, floral arrangements of military precision, place cards at each setting. Lena located hers between Victor and an unfamiliar male. Victor's card was positioned at the head. Heels. Second only to Salvatore. She sat. Early 30s, dark hair, strong olfactory signature of expensive cologne. You must be the new Mrs. Castelli. Lena. Marco. He offered his hand, Victor's younger sibling. Heels. Lena reciprocated the handshake. His grip was excessive. A clear dominance display. Congratulations on the child. Thank you. We are very excited. Marco's gaze remained on her face. You're younger than I anticipated. Heels. You are exactly as young as I anticipated. Heels. Marco's smile showed signs of collapse. Victor always had a preference for those with verbal acuity. Did he? I wouldn't know. I am the first spouse, perhaps. But believe me, sweetheart, you are not the first woman to occupy his bed, feels. Lena maintained a neutral expression, and yet I am the one with the ring. Marco's jaw tightened. He began to form a response, but Victor arrived, occupying the seat on Lena's other side. Feels. The look he directed at his brother was of sufficient intensity to metaphorically alter the state of water. Marco. Victor. A lovely gathering. Fathers' gatherings are never lovely. They are tactical maneuvers. Feels. Victor's hand located Lena's beneath the table, squeezing once. How is Sophia? Still simulating happiness. How is your wife? Still simulating a lack of terror. Lena leaned into their shared space. Feels. I am right here. The question can be addressed to me directly. Both men turned their focus to her. Are you terrified? Marco asked. Of you, no. You should be. Why? Because your wife is pregnant. Congratulations. Feels. That is not an indicator of dangerousness, but of desperation. Lena picked up her water glass, a self-soothing gesture. Desperation leads to tactical errors. Marco's face flushed with blood. You little. Careful. Victor's voice was low, lethal. Feels. You are addressing my wife. Select your next words with extreme care, Marco. The table had fallen silent. All observers were focused on the confrontation. Marco rose. Excuse me, I require air. He exited. Lena set down her glass. Feels. Her hand exhibited a fine tremor. Victor's thumb moved across her knuckles, a tactile gesture of acknowledgement. Feels. That was reckless. He initiated, and you escalated the interaction. You were instructed not to display fear. There is a distinction between confidence and provocation. Perhaps the boundary should have been more clearly defined for you. Feels. Lena withdrew her hand. You brought me into this environment. You instructed me to perform a role. Do not express anger when I improvise. Victor's eyes scanned hers. Impossibly, a corner of his mouth twitched. Feels. You are going to get us both terminated. At least the process will be interesting. The meal service commenced. Salvatore presided, consuming little, speaking less. Elena held court at mid-table, deploying practiced charm on the guests. Feels. Marco returned, but avoided eye contact with Lena. His wife, Sophia, was seated opposite, visibly pregnant and exhibiting signs of distress. Lena experienced a moment of empathy, feels, which she then suppressed upon recalling that the woman was carrying the biological asset that could precipitate her own termination. The food was of high quality, course after course. Lena ate with caution, mirroring Victor's selections, feels, drinking only water, and noting Elena's observation of his behavior with a small smile. Between the third and fourth courses, Salvatore stood, striking his glass. The room fell silent. My children, he began, his voice carrying despite its frailty, feels, and their spouses. It is pleasant to have you all under a single roof. A rare occurrence. His gaze swept the table. I am dying. You are all aware of this, and you are all aware of what follows. Feels. Succession, legacy, the future of the enterprise I built. He paused. I observe some of you are in advantageous positions, others are not. Some have made bold strategic moves, others have opted for safety. But understand this, the timeline is finite, feels, and when my life ends, only one of you will remain. The silence was profound. Then Elena raised her glass, to family. All participants drank, excluding Lena. She left her glass on the table. Victor noted this, leaning close. Feels. Smart. I am adapting. The remainder of the meal was conducted through strained verbal exchanges. Politics, business, thinly veiled insults presented as compliments. Lena remained silent, observing the power dynamics, feels, identifying allegiances and animosities. Feels. By the dessert course, she was experiencing a tension headache. Salvatore stood once more. Before you depart, he announced, I have a proclamation. The room's collective tension increased. In 2 weeks, we will host the annual charity gala. Feels. Black tie, 500 guests, media, cameras, the entire spectacle. His gaze fixed on Victor. I expect you and your bride to be in attendance, presenting a united front. Victor's facial expression remained unchanged. Of course, good. Feels. Because the entire city will be observing, and if you cannot convince them of this marriage's authenticity, you cannot convince me it is an asset worth protecting. The threat was left to linger in the air. Salvatore sat. Dinner concluded. Feels. The attendees began to depart, their movements slow, deliberate, like predators circling prior to a kill. Feels. Subject Elena paused at their position during her exit. Her verbal directive to Victor was a thinly veiled threat assessment. 2 weeks. Try not to embarrass the family. He offered a placid response. Her focus then shifted to the subject, Lena, feels, clinically labeling her a liability, a variable that introduces unacceptable risk. And liabilities get people killed, Bay, she stated, framing the threat as friendly advice. Following their departure, Lena initiated a moment of nonverbal communication with the female associate, Sophia. In this exchange, Lena reported observing a mirrored expression of entrapment, a classic case of projective identification, where she saw her own psychological confinement reflected in another, reinforcing the diagnosis of them both as prisoners in disparate enclosures. The vehicular transit back to the residence was characterized by a complete absence of communication. Victor exhibited physiological signs of extreme stress, a clenched jaw and rigid posture while gazing out the window. The subject, Lena, displayed a desire for reassurance but correctly interpreted his nonverbal cues as hostile, leading her to adopt a strategy of silence. Upon arrival, Victor's actions were ritualistic and self-regulatory. He secured the perimeter by locking the bedroom door, then immediately engaged in substance use, consuming 2 measures of whiskey in rapid succession. When questioned about his behavior, his initial response was a sharp bitter laugh, a common deflection, for paradoxically declared her performance perfect, revealing a significant internal conflict. He confirmed she was confident, sharp, unflinching. His analysis continued. You went toe-to-toe with Marco and Elena and didn't blink. He then revealed a critical development. And my father liked you. Do you understand how rare that is? The subject's confusion prompted Victor to articulate the core problem. The problem is that now they know you're not a prop, you're a player, and players get targeted. He admitted his initial strategic miscalculation. He had brought her into the conflict viewing her as an inanimate object, background noise, but her performance had reclassified her as an active agent. You just painted a target on your back, Lena, and I can't unpaint it. Her retort, I did what you told me to do, was met not with denial, but with escalating agitation. I'm angry because I underestimated you, he confessed, voice rising. I thought you'd need protecting, but you don't. You held your own. And now I have to figure out how to keep you alive when everyone in that room tonight decided you're a threat. The subject reported a corresponding spike in heart rate. Her statement, I didn't ask for this, was met with his neither did I. A period of silence ensued. The subject then closed the physical distance between them, a gesture of re-engagement, and requested a strategic directive. So what do we do? Victor's response was immediate. We prepare. The objective was the upcoming gala, an event with 500 witnesses and mass media coverage. His gaze locked with hers. And we convince everyone watching that we're not just married, we're in love. When she questioned the methodology, he stated, we practice. The subject's breath audibly hitched. Practice what? His hand made initial contact, a calculated touch to her cheek. The contact was described as warm and deliberate. This, he specified, being comfortable with each other. Looking like we can't keep our hands apart, his thumb moved along her jawline, a form of tactile conditioning. Can you do that? The subject reported a significant psychosomatic response, a sensation of her skin being on fire. Her verbal response was uncertain. Try. Lena initiated reciprocal contact, placing her hand on his chest, a means of biofeedback, noting his steady heartbeat. He instructed her to perform the action with more convincing intent. She complied, moving her hand to his hair, his pupils dilated. Better? Better. He then used his other hand to decrease the space between them. At the gala, we'll dance, we'll touch. We'll look at it. Can you sell that? Can you? His reply was a direct admission of his manipulative capabilities. I'm very good at lying, Lena. This isn't lying. This is acting. Same skill set. He closed the remaining distance, foreheads 2 weeks. We make them believe, and maybe we survive long enough for this to end. The subject closed her eyes, noting his respiration on her skin and the cognitive dissonance between performance and an emerging reality. What if I can't? She asked, verbalizing her anxiety. You can. You already did tonight. That was different. That was anger. This is Her sentence trailed off, unable to articulate the new emotional state. This is what? Victor created just enough space to reestablish eye contact. The intimacy of the moment prompted an observable shift in his own expression. Yes, I don't know if I can fake that. Then don't fake it. The subject's cardiac rhythm faltered. What? His grip on her waist intensified. You want this to look real? Make it real. He elaborated on the manipulative directive. Not the love, not the future, but the moment, the touch, the proximity. Stop fighting what's already happening. The The subject's denial, "Nothing's happening," was immediately countered. "Liar," feels. His voice lowered in pitch. "You felt it at dinner, when I held your hand, when I defended you, when Marco pushed and you pushed back, and I wanted to put him through the table for talking to you like that." He then defined the emotional state himself, feels, offering clinical labels. Possessiveness, yes. Protectiveness, also yes. But it's real, Lena, and if you stop pretending it isn't, this gets a hell of a lot easier. The subject experienced throat constriction. She recalled his previous declaration, feels. "You said you'd never love me. I won't." "Then what is this?" "Survival," he stated, reinforcing the transactional framework. "I protect what's mine. You're mine. That's not love. That's fact. And if we lean into that, we might actually pull this off." Feels. The subject, Lena, should have initiated withdrawal and reiterated the contractual nature of their arrangement. Instead, the tactile sensation from his hand and the intensity of his gaze overrode her logical defenses. Feels. For the first time since the marriage, her feeling of isolation dissipated. "Okay," she whispered, capitulating. He sought confirmation, "okay? We make it real. The moments, the touches, the performance." She then attempted to set a future boundary. Feels. "But when this is over, you walk away. Nothing changes." His jaw tensed. "I promise." Lena nodded and created distance. His hand fell away. The subject registered the loss of physical contact as a negative stimulus which she actively suppressed. Feels. "I'm going to get changed." He stopped her before she could exit. Feels. "You were incredible tonight," Victor stated quietly. "I need you to know that." The subject reported a warm yet dangerous and unwelcome emotional response in her chest. Feels. She offered a brief acknowledgement and retreated before her positive facial expression could be observed. The subsequent 2 weeks constituted a new phase of psychological conditioning, described by the subject as a different kind of prison. Feels. Victor altered his routine to maximize proximity, engaging in shared meals and co-working sessions. This period was marked by systematic desensitization to physical intimacy through practice. His hand on her back, their intertwined fingers, feels, adjusting his collar. These small repeated actions were designed to normalize physical contact and erode emotional boundaries, with each touch leaving a psychological imprint. Feels. One evening during a storm in the library, the subject initiated a probe for authentic self-disclosure. "Tell me something true," Lena requested, clarifying the parameters. "About you, not the business, not the family, just you." Feels. After a prolonged silence and a query into her motives, she explained, "Because if I'm going to convince 500 people I'm in love with you, I should probably know more than the fact that you like your coffee black." Victor closed his laptop. Feels, signaling his compliance. "What do you want to know? Anything real." After a moment of consideration, he made a significant disclosure. "I used to play piano." The subject expressed surprise. Feels. "Seriously? My mother insisted before she died. Classical training, 8 years of lessons." A micro-expression of contempt crossed his face. "I was good, really good." He reported that external assessments suggested he had professional potential. Feels. When asked what prevented this course of action, he identified the primary antagonist, my father. He said music was a weakness, that men in our world couldn't afford softness. Victor's gaze became unfocused, a sign of memory recall. Feels. "I haven't touched a piano in 30 years. Lena put down her book. "Do you miss it?" "Every day." The candor in his admission triggered a strong empathetic response in the subject. She recalled an instrument in the East Wing and suggested he use it. Feels. He initially resisted, but she persisted, reframing it as him taking his own advice about not disappearing. Feels. She issued a direct command, "Play for me." After a moment of apparent cognitive dissonance, he acquiesced, warning, "But don't expect anything beautiful." They proceeded to the East Wing. The grand piano was located in a state of neglect. Victor sat, Feels, hesitated, and then began to play. The piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Despite the instrument's poor condition, the subject perceived the performance as profoundly beautiful. She observed a marked change in his physiology. Feels. His hands moved with remembered skill, his shoulders relaxed, and the defensive armor of his public persona seemed to dissolve. She was no longer observing the Mafia Heir, but a past version of him, a self buried by familial expectation and trauma. Feels. Upon the final note's decay, a heavy silence settled. "That was beautiful," Lena whispered. Victor's hands remained on the keys. "I'd forgotten what it felt like," he said. When asked to clarify, he specified, Feels, "being something other than what my father made me." The subject's empathy intensified. Acting on impulse, she sat beside him, their shoulders making contact. You're more than that. You know that, right? Victor turned, their faces now in close proximity. Heels. Am I? Yes. His gaze shifted to her mouth. Lena, he began, then hesitated. If we keep doing this, if we keep getting closer, it's going to make the end harder. The subject acknowledged the logical conclusion. I know. He pressed for confirmation. Heels. And you're okay with that? Her answer revealed a conscious acceptance of the pathological bond. No. Yes. Heels. Subject Victor's hand initiated contact, framing her face. His thumb stroked her lower lip, a classic dominance gesture. You're a terrible liar. Her retort, so are you. His response is telling, I'm an excellent liar. It's the truth I'm bad at. Heels. A textbook narcissistic admission. Lena's breath hitched, a physiological response to heightened emotional stress. Then tell me something true. You terrify me. This confession of vulnerability hung in the air. Why? She whispered. Heels. Because you make me want things I swore I'd never want again. He closed the distance, a physical manifestation of his breached defenses. And I can't afford that. Not now. Not ever. Lena closed her eyes, a gesture of submission. So what do we do? Heels. We keep pretending, he dictated. When it's over, we walk away before this becomes something neither of us can survive. A mutual agreement to maintain the facade. Yet neither subject moved. Heels. When Victor initiated the kiss, soft, careful, as if handling a fragile object, Lena did not resist. Heels. She reciprocated the kiss, and at that moment, the constructed reality they inhabited became pathologically reinforced. The event was not discussed. Not the next morning as Victor departed, nor during a chess game where his touch lingered. Heels. Nor over a dinner where the silence was thick with unspoken transference. The lack of communication is typical in such trauma bonds. Yet behavior patterns shifted. Physical contact became more frequent, more instinctual, his hand on her waist. Heels. Her fingers on his shoulder. Their sleeping arrangement evolved. The barrier of pillows vanished, leaving two subjects in a space too vast for associates but too confined for the escalating psychological entanglement. Heels. 3 days prior to the gala, Lena awoke to find Victor already dressed, observing the window. What time is it? Her voice was hoarse. 5:30. Why are you up? Couldn't sleep? He remained turned away. Marco's wife went into labor last night. Heels. Lena sat upright. What? Premature. 34 weeks. They're at the hospital. Victor's vocal tone was flat, affectless. A common response to narcissistic injury. If the baby survives, if it's healthy, I lose. The statement settled over the environment. Heels. Lena exited the bed, approaching him. You don't know that yet. I know the odds. Odds aren't guarantees. Victor finally faced her, his expression rigid. I have spent 2 months preparing for this. Built contingencies, moved assets, made plans. Heels. And it might all be over before the gala even happens. Then we wait, she countered. See what happens. And if Marco wins? Lena's chest tightened, a somatic response to anxiety. Then we deal with it. There's no dealing with it, Lena. Heels. If he takes succession, you become a target. The contract becomes void. His focus is on the structural collapse of his plan, framing her danger as an extension of his own failure. Not nothing, she argued, taking his hand. My mother's sober, safe. Heels. That doesn't change. A moment of cognitive dissonance, attempting to find value outside their dynamic. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're scared. So am I. But standing here catastrophizing doesn't help. Lena moved closer. Heels. How long before you know? Hours, days. Premature births are unpredictable. Then we go about our day. Heels. We prepare for the gala like nothing's changed, and when you get word, we figure out our next move. Victor observed her. You're being remarkably calm about this. One of us has to be. A classic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. Heels. Where the victim takes on the role of emotional regulator for the captor. His mouth twitched into a near smile. When did you get so steady? About the time you started falling apart. This elicited a genuine, though brief, smile. I'm not falling apart. Heels. You're spiraling. There's a difference, but it's close. Lena pulled his hand. Come back to bed. You won't get any answers standing at the window. I don't think I can sleep. Then lie down and worry horizontally. Heels. At least that way I can keep an eye on you. Victor allowed her to lead him back to the bed. Heels. They lay facing one another, his exhaustion apparent. I should have picked someone else. For what? This. He gestured vaguely. Someone harder. Someone who wouldn't have made me. He trailed off. Made you what? Care. The admission hung in the air. Heels. Lena's breath caught. Victor, I know. It's not supposed to matter. You're a means to an end. But somewhere, it started mattering, and I don't know how to unmatter it. Her throat tightened. Maybe you're not supposed to. Feels. Her validation of his feelings reinforces the pathological bond. That's not helpful. It's honest. He traced her jawline. When this is over, when you leave, I'm not going to be okay. Yes, you will. How do you know? Because you're Victor Castelli. Feels. You survive everything. She held his hand to her cheek. Feels. That's what you do. What if I don't want to just survive anymore? The question was a confession. Lena had no clinical response. Instead, she closed the distance and initiated a kiss. This was not a strategic maneuver. Feels. It was an act of two individuals clinging to a shared delusion with a known termination point. When they broke contact, their foreheads touched. This is a mistake, probably. We should stop. We should. Neither moved. Feels. The external world intruded at noon. Victor's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID, his body becoming rigid. Feels. It's my father. Leon on her fork. Victor answered. Yes. A pause when? Another pause and? A prolonged silence, his jaw clenched. He ended the call. Lena inquired. The baby's alive, boy, 4 pounds. In the NICU. Feels. Her stomach dropped, a visceral reaction. So Marco might win if the baby stabilizes, if there are no complications. Victor began pacing, a physical display of his loss of control. They're calling it touch and go. Could survive, could die. Feels. We won't know for 72 hours. What do? We wait, and we go to that gala and smile. Lena's response showed a complete alignment with his goals. Victor, I'm not giving up yet. He stopped. This isn't over until my father declares a winner. Feels. And he won't do that until he's certain the child will survive. So we have time. Lena approached him. Then we make it count. The subsequent days existed in a state of suspended animation. Victor engaged in constant activity, calls, meetings, feels, discussions from which Lena was excluded. He appeared exhausted, hypervigilant, operating on pure drive. Lena adapted her behavior to his needs, providing space, offering silent company, and engaging in chess as a distraction. She lost every game, feels, a symbolic acceptance of her submissive role, yet continued to play to stabilize him. The evening before the gala, dinner was silent. Feels. Halfway through, Victor put his fork down. I need to tell you something. Lena looked at him. What? If Marco's child survives, if I lose succession, I'm not letting you go quietly. What does that mean? It means I'll honor the contract. Feels. Your mother's debt is cleared. You get your payout. But I'm putting you in protective custody until I can guarantee Marco won't come after you. For how long? As long as it takes. Lena's chest constricted. That could be months, years. Feels. Better alive and hiding than dead. His logic is absolute. You can't just lock me away. I can and I will. His tone was final. You think I'm letting you walk out of here unprotected? He'll kill you, Lena. Feels. Not immediately, but he'll do it. So, what? I'm a prisoner forever? You're alive forever. There's a difference. Lena pushed away from the table. This is insane. This is reality, Victor stated, rising. Feels. You don't get to die because I failed. That's not how this ends. You don't get to decide how my life ends. Actually, according to the contract, I do. Until you're released, I'm responsible for your safety. A cold, contractual assertion of control. Feels. Lena's outburst was predictable. I hate you. No, you don't. I do right now. Victor approached her, framing her face with his hands. Hate me all you want, but you're surviving this. Feels. Even if I don't. The statement was delivered like a clinical diagnosis. What does that mean? It means if Marco wins, I become a threat, and threats get eliminated. Victor. I'm not stupid, Lena. I know how this works. If I lose, feels. I have maybe 6 months before a car accident, a heart attack, some convenient tragedy. His thumbs moved over her cheekbones. But you get to live. That's not negotiable. A classic martyr complex positioning his control as a final act of protection. Feels. Stop talking like you're already dead. I'm talking like someone who understands the stakes. Then fight harder. I am fighting. I've been fighting since the day we met. Feels. But some battles can't be won, Lena. And if this is one of them, I need to know you're protected. I need you to stop giving up. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. Realistic is another word for defeated. Lena pulled away. Feels. You told me you protect what's yours. So protect yourself. Because if you die, I don't get to move on. I spend most of my existence knowing you died because I wasn't enough of a reason to keep fighting. Feels. The victim now demands the captor fight not for himself, but for the preservation of their pathological bond. Victor stared at her. You think I'm not fighting for you? I think you're fighting for the contract, for obligation, for pride, but not for this. Feels. She pressed her hand to his chest. Feels. Not for what this actually became. What did it become? Lena's voice broke. You tell me. The silence was heavy. Then Victor pulled her into a constricting embrace. I don't know what this is, he said into her hair, but I know I didn't plan it. Feels. I know it scares the hell out of me, and I know that if something happens to you because of my world, I'll burn everything to the ground. A threat of extreme narcissistic rage, not a declaration of love. Lena's arms went around him. Then don't die. Feels. I'll do my best. Promise me, Lena. Promise me, Victor. He pulled back, meeting her gaze. I promise I'll fight like hell to survive. This was the only assurance he could provide. Feels. The subject, Lena, was awakened at 0700, her schedule for the day predetermined. It's a classic control tactic, removing autonomy to foster dependence. Victor's physical absence was a calculated maneuver. Feels. He communicated through directives, not conversation. A proxy, Mrs. Kozlov, delivered the instructions and an envelope, a further layer of detachment. Inside, the note and the velvet box represent a two-pronged psychological tool. Feels. The note is a command, while the ring, a familial totem, described as untouched, serves to create a powerful, unearned sense of intimacy and obligation. This is not a gift. It is the bestowing of a psychological leash. Feels. Lena's examination of the artifact is noted, a simple, elegant ring which she interprets through a normative lens of romantic commitment. Feels. Her physiological response, a shaking hand, indicates the cognitive dissonance between the situation's reality and the symbolic meaning she assigns to the object. The day's preparations can be classified as a process of identity reconstruction. Feels. The stylist, the provocative dress, the elevation by 4-inch heels, the insured jewelry, all serve to erase her previous self. Her subsequent failure to recognize her own reflection is a textbook symptom of depersonalization. Feels. A state where she now appears as an asset, curated for Victor's world. The solitary transport to the gala reinforces her isolation, making him the sole point of stability in a hostile environment. Feels. The subject's arrival triggers acute anxiety, a predictable response to being thrust into a high-threat social environment without her primary controller. Note the physiological symptoms. A twisting stomach. Feels. Victor's appearance is strategically delayed, allowing her anxiety to peak, thus framing his arrival as a rescue. His assessment, "You look stunning," feels, is less a compliment and more an affirmation that the asset has been prepared to his specifications. His subsequent correction, "You're early," is a subtle but potent act of gaslighting. Feels. Designed to maintain psychological dominance by controlling the narrative of time and place. Feels. His hand on her waist is an act of possession, a nonverbal signal to the room. The instructions that follow are rules of engagement for a codependent performance. Use it, he advises regarding her terror. Feels. Demonstrating a sociopathic reframing of fear into a tool. The directive, "Don't give them anything real, accept each other," is a critical manipulation. Feels. It establishes a folie à deux, a shared psychosis where their bond is positioned as the only authentic element in a world of deception. They are to perform for hours, with Victor introducing her to subjects whose identities are irrelevant. Feels. She is a novelty, a prop in his succession narrative, a role she performs while under his constant physical control. Feels. The antagonist, Elena, enters. Her approach is a classic probe for weakness, targeting Victor's succession anxiety via the status of a rival's offspring. Feels. Victor's physical response, a tightening grip on Lena, is an involuntary display of this anxiety. Elena's taunt is designed to destabilize their unit. Lena's counterattack, however, is significant. Feels. She bypasses a defensive posture and launches a direct assault on Elena's own core vulnerability, her arrested development and pathological need for paternal approval. Feels. It is a surprisingly adept display of psychological warfare for a subject so new to this environment. Feels. Elena's reaction is a frozen smile, a mask-slip moment revealing the accuracy of Lena's attack. Victor's covered laugh serves as immediate positive reinforcement, rewarding Lena's aggression. His comment, "You're going to get us killed," feels, spoken with amusement, indicates that he values this high-risk, high-reward behavior. He initiates a dance, a public ritual to re-establish their united front. On the dance floor, he physically reasserts control, leading her through a slow, feels, romantic piece. Their movements, synchronized as if practiced for years, are a physical manifestation of their rapidly solidifying trauma bond. Feels. The dialogue during the dance is revealing. Victor's admission of training in etiquette and violence normalizes the pathological duality of his existence. His seemingly unguarded statement, "And you're beautiful," feels, is a well-timed injection of affection, a potent tool of intermittent reinforcement that deepens the subject's attachment. He correctly diagnoses her psychological evolution. She has learned to weaponize fear, feels. This is not a compliment on her courage, but an observation of her successful adaptation to his world's brutal rules. His pride is that of a creator observing his creation, feels. The subject's emotional response to his approval, tears, is quickly suppressed as she vocalizes that such moments make the pretense harder. This is the core paradox of Stockholm Syndrome. The dance becomes an immersive, feels, dissociative experience where the external world fades. It is a shared delusion of safety and intimacy. This state is abruptly shattered by the appearance of the patriarch, Salvatore Castelli. He is the prime mover of the family's psychopathology, feels, and his presence immediately dissolves the illusion. Victor's body language shifts, signaling a return to a high-threat reality. Here we go, feels. Salvatore's initial query, or are you very good actors, is a direct test of their bond's utility. Before Victor, the primary subject, can respond, Lena intervenes. Her explanation is a textbook rationalization of the trauma bond, feels. She posits that their simple transaction organically evolved into something genuine. She is articulating the narrative required for her own psychological survival. By finding Victor's hand, she grounds herself in the bond she has just described, feels. What we're acting out, that part's real, she claims. It is a profound statement on the nature of self-deception in coercive relationships, feels. The patriarch shifts pressure back to the succession, a known stressor for Victor. In response to Salvatore's analysis, Lena reframes her own condition, articulating a cognitive shift from trapped to chosen, feels. This reinterpretation is a critical defense mechanism, allowing her to reclaim a sense of agency within a situation where she has none. She observes Victor's tension and aligns herself with him completely, feels. This is the final stage of identification with the aggressor. Her plight and his are now one and the same, feels. Salvatore's assessment is clinically astute. He identifies the attachment as a liability, predicting that the family system will tear itself apart and that Victor must be ready. His gaze, described as sharp, feels, is an evaluation of his son's psychological fitness. He poses the ultimate test for a megalomaniac. Is he willing to sacrifice everything, to burn it all down, to protect what he claims as his, feels? The question is designed to expose whether Victor's core narcissistic drive for power remains intact or has been compromised by this emotional entanglement, feels. The patriarch's warning is explicit. They'll use her against you. He lays out the inevitable choice, her or the empire. This is the crux of the diagnostic session. Victor's response is immediate and cold. Then I pick her, feels. He frames his decision not in terms of love, but of ownership. She's mine, he states. This is the ultimate expression of his narcissism. He is not abandoning the empire for a person, feels. He is declaring that his personal possession is of greater value than the empire itself. It is an act of supreme defiant self-will against the patriarchal authority, feels. The surrounding subjects react to the gravity of this declaration. Salvatore labels his son a fool, the judgment of a traditional psychopath on one who allows emotion to dictate strategy. Yet he immediately pivots, feels, offering Victor an indirect solution, a veiled suggestion to eliminate the infant rival in NICU room 412. The phrasing, unfortunate accidents, is a classic tool of plausible deniability. He is testing whether his son, feels, despite his proclaimed emotional attachment, still possesses the necessary ruthlessness to secure power, feels. Lena's reaction is one of visceral horror, a response rooted in a moral framework outside this system. Victor's physical stillness indicates profound internal conflict. His refusal, I won't, not that, never that, feels, establishes a moral boundary previously unconfirmed. He rejects his father's final, most pathological test. I'm not my father, he states, confirming a divergence in their psychopathic profiles, feels. He demonstrates an unwillingness to harm non-combatants, particularly a child, even at the cost of the ultimate prize. For Lena, this refusal to cross a fundamental moral line will be perceived as ultimate validation, feels, cementing the trauma bond more powerfully than any act of affection ever could, feels. The subject, Victor, took her hand, a gesture of placation. We wait, he stated. His articulation of hoping the rival's heir survives suggests a conflict within his pathology, feels. A desire to maintain a self-concept of honor while engaging in a ruthless power struggle. The contingency plan is presented not as self-preservation, but as a mechanism to ensure her survival. A classic manipulation, feels. Lena's demand for choice, for a life beyond mere survival, signals a crucial development in the subject's trauma bond. It is a negotiation for agency within the confines of the captor-captive dynamic. Victor's physical response, pulling her close, feels as a nonverbal reassertion of control. Feels. I promise. The gala proceeded as a study in managed perception. Both subjects engaged in the necessary social rituals, performing the role of a stable couple. When the photographer prompted a kiss, feels. Victor's action was reportedly executed without hesitation, described as a display of genuine affection. This act served to dissolve the transactional pretense for Lena. For her, it confirmed the emotional reality of their bond, feels. A classic case of projective identification. The psychological prognosis became clear. The impending outcome, regardless of its nature, would inflict severe emotional trauma for which neither subject was adequately prepared, feels. The signal arrived at 0300. Lena observed Victor on the bed, his posture, shoulders rigid, indicating high stress. The voice on the phone was described as clipped, urgent, feels. Victor processed the information in silence before terminating the call. What happened? Lena inquired, shifting her posture to one of engagement. His reply was delivered without direct eye contact. Marco's son died an hour ago, respiratory failure, feels. The clinical details were relayed without emotional inflection. The news, which should logically provide strategic relief, instead introduced a complex emotional variable, a child's death. Lena offered a standard expression of sympathy. I'm sorry, feels. Victor's response was flat, devoid of affect. Don't be. I'm not. He exhibits a purely sociopathic calculus. That child's death just saved both our lives. He then questions the morality of his own gratitude, feels. A fleeting moment of cognitive dissonance. Lena's attempt to reframe him as a servivore is a textbook coping mechanism, feels. A monster, he countered. His self-assessment versus her rationalization. A monster would have caused it. Highlights the core dynamic. He recognizes his own pathology. She works to negate it, preserving the idealized image of her captor, feels. A significant difference. Victor finally made eye contact, his expression described as hollow. He then began pacing, a physical manifestation of his anxiety, outlining the escalating strategic threats from his siblings, Elena and Dominic, feels. His fight for succession is now tinged with ambivalence. Lena's suggestion to stop fighting represents a pivotal moment, an attempt by the captive to engineer an escape for them both. That's not how this works, feels. Why not? She pressed. His explanation is rooted in a clear understanding of his pathological environment, because walking away doesn't mean they stop coming. He correctly identifies that escape is not freedom but a different kind of prison, feels. This demonstrates high-level executive functioning despite his emotional state. He then shifts from a defensive posture to an offensive one, kneeling before her to establish a different kind of intimacy and control. We finish this, feels. His new objective is presented as a messianic campaign. Win succession, then burn down the corrupt elements of his father's empire. He's creating a new noble narrative to justify his ambition. He can't change the family's diagnosis, feels, but he believes he can alter its future behavior, feels. The inclusion of his mother and other female family members as victims reinforces his new messianic role. He is now not just a contender, but a savior. Lena's physical response, pulling him into an embrace, shows her complete acceptance of this narrative, feels. It's a powerful moment of enmeshment. Her assertion, "You're not dying," is a direct challenge to his fatalism. You don't get a vote. Watch me. His brief laugh is a release of tension. Lena then explicitly redefines their relationship, feels, shifting from captor to partner. This verbalization is critical for her own psyche. Is that what we are? His question feigns uncertainty, but her reply solidifies the new terms of their pathological bond. It is now something worth fighting for, feels. The subsequent kiss is a physical sealing of this new contract, a promise. He then outlines the anticipated escalation, accurately predicting the hostile reactions of Elena, Dominic, and his father, feels. He presents the high probability of an assassination attempt. It's a test. Lena's visceral reaction, her stomach twisted, is noted, but her verbal response is one of solidarity. Then we make sure you survive. When he says we, she fully commits, feels, co-opting the language of their original fraudulent vows and declaring them real. She now sees herself as an active participant, refusing to be protected by being pushed away, feels. Victor's acceptance is conditional. Okay, you're in. He immediately establishes the new rules of engagement, demanding absolute compliance. You follow my lead. If I tell you to run, you run. She agrees. A deal, feels. They remained in physical contact until dawn, a shared state of hyperarousal in anticipation of the coming conflict. At noon, the patriarch, Salvatore, confirmed the continuation of the succession crisis. His appearance was described as more dead than alive. The media reaction was predictably frenzied. Alina, a rival with similar narcissistic traits, immediately released a statement leveraging the situation to her advantage, a calculated move. Dominic followed suit. Marco, the bereaved, remained silent. Lina observed these events from the library, a space of passive observation, while Victor engaged in active strategy. Her feeling of uselessness reinforces her dependency. She assumed the only role she could. She waited. The attack came 3 days later, not as a physical assault, but as informational warfare. The vehicle was an expose, citing anonymous sources and detailing Victor's illicit financial activities, accurately portraying him as deeply corrupt. The report was factual. Its purpose was annihilation of his public persona. Lina found him in his office, displaying a catatonic-like focus on the screen, his face described as carved from ice. He correctly identified the attacker. Alina leaked it. His initial assessment was one of hopelessness. Nothing. There's nothing to do. He accurately predicted the legal and political fallout, culminating in his defeat. He assessed the situation as a loss. I'm done, Lina. Her response was immediate and forceful, a rejection of his assessment. No. She physically intervened, grabbing his face, forcing engagement. This is a profound role reversal. The captive becomes the primary motivator, refusing to allow the captor to succumb to a narcissistic injury. Her voice trembled, a sign of her own dysregulation. You told me you wanted to change things, she reminded him. Invoking the messianic narrative he had constructed. This isn't a punch, this is a knockout, he argued. Only if you stay down, she countered. Her eyes burned into his. The command to get up is primal. Faced with his psychological collapse, Lina formulates a radical new strategy. I suggest we stop playing their game and start playing ours. She proposes not to deny the charges, but to embrace them, to own them. Victor's assessment of this as insane is logical. The strategy is counterintuitive. Lina's rationale is that in their corrupt world, authenticity, even an admission of pathology, is a revolutionary act. She posits that by ceasing the pretense of innocence, he could achieve a new form of power. What if you stop pretending? The subject was quiet, processing. Then he began to laugh, a release of the catatonic tension. The absurdity of confessing to felonies on television was not lost on him. Lina's question, is it working? Refocused him. Victor's subsequent action, pulling her into his lap and kissing her, was a reassertion of physical dominance while simultaneously ceding to her strategic guidance. You're either a genius or completely insane, he stated. Both assessments could be considered clinically accurate. If I do this, there's no going back. He correctly assesses the extreme risk. He would be targeted by law enforcement and his family simultaneously. Then we make sure you're bulletproof, Lina responded, solidifying their unit. We. Her refusal to leave is absolute. The following kiss was softer, an indicator of acceptance. Okay, we do it your way. Having agreed, his mind immediately shifted to tactical necessities. But we need leverage. He understood that to survive the fallout, he required a mechanism of mutually assured destruction, evidence that could implicate everyone else if he were to fall. The next phase was preparation for total war. The subject, Victor, had collated extensive documentation, not merely of his own transgressions, but of the entire familial unit. Elena, Dominic, the patriarch. Every illicit agreement, every laundered dollar, every concealed pathology was catalogued. He was preparing for a complete systemic detonation. The press conference was strategically timed for a Friday, ensuring peak media exposure. Victor engaged a premier public relations agency, not for narrative control, but for maximum dissemination. On the designated morning, the female subject Lina observed Victor already prepared. His attire, suit tie, was the symbolic armor for his impending act. Ready? She inquired. No, but the action proceeds regardless. He extended his hand. Accompany me to the conference, to the entirety of the event. Your presence is required. Victor, my attendance recontextualizes the optics. It frames this as a personal dynamic instead of it is about us. It is the selection of an authentic variable over a corrupt one. His gaze locked with hers. Please. Lina took his hand, exhibiting a classic signifier of compliance. They proceeded to the venue together, a hotel ballroom, oversaturated with media personnel, reporters, Cameras, strobe lighting. Lena was positioned in the front row. Victor assumed the podium. Then he commenced his address. Eels. My name is Victor Castelli. I am the firstborn son of Salvatore Castelli, and for the last 30 years I have been a complicit agent in constructing an empire founded on corruption, violence, and exploitation. A clinical silence fell over the room. Eels. Victor's effect remained flat, his gaze fixed on the recording devices. I have laundered funds. I have suborned public officials. Eels. I have employed illegal tactics to secure contracts, granting my family a pathological competitive advantage. I have engaged in acts that induced insomnia and resulted in profound identity dysmorphia. Eels. A reporter began an outburst. Victor raised a hand to halt it. I have not concluded. He paused. This disclosure is a termination of pretense, a termination of my role in a system that consumes individuals and excretes capital. Eels. And a termination of observing my family destroy lives to preserve a legacy. He produced a USB drive, displaying it. This device contains the evidence. Every illegal transaction, every corrupt arrangement, not just mine, but everyone's. My father, Eels, my siblings, associates, partners, the full scope. Eels. Victor's vocal tone was unwavering, detached. This data will be released to federal authorities immediately following this event, and I will cooperate fully with the resulting investigation. The room erupted, a chaotic influx of questions and noise. Eels. Victor remained disengaged from it. His focus located Lena. This action is predicated on the lesson that survival is not synonymous with living, that entrapment within a system does not preclude its destruction. Eels. And that the only method for changing a rotten structure is its complete incineration. He stepped back from the podium. Security personnel immediately formed a perimeter, directing him toward an exit. Lena navigated the crowd, Eels reaching him as they emerged outside. Eels. You did it, she stated. I terminated my known existence. You initiated a new one. Victor pulled her into mystery. My survival over the next 48 hours is contingent on our survival. We will survive. They entered the vehicle, Eels, returned to the estate, and awaited the consequences. The reaction was swift. Federal agents manifested that evening. They presented warrants, posed questions. Victor surrendered all materials, cooperating without resistance. Eels. They departed with voluminous evidence and the assurance of his future testimony. His father formally disowned him before midnight. A public declaration stated Victor Castelli was excised from the family, no longer an heir, a non-entity. Eels. Elena and Dominic retained counsel within hours. Marco remained silent, and Lena remained by Victor's side. Eels. The investigation spanned 3 months. 3 months of depositions and testimony. Media narratives bifurcated, casting Victor as either a messianic figure or a traitor. This was a period of heightened threat potential. Eels. Requiring doubled security details. Yet a peculiar phenomenon occurred. The public began to process the deeper pathology. Not just the criminal acts, but the systemic corruption that had been normalized. Eels. Victor became an unexpected symbol, an individual who possessed everything and chose total destruction over continued complicity. When indictments followed, when Elena, Dominic, and numerous associates were arrested, Eels. When Salvatore was charged and confined to house arrest, Victor accepted a plea agreement. Eels. Community service, financial restitution, probation, but no incarceration. The prosecution labeled him a cooperating witness whose testimony dismantled an organization that had functioned with impunity for decades. Victor termed it survival. Lena, Eels, in a clear display of Stockholm Syndrome, termed it a second chance. 6 months post-press conference, they stood amid the deconstruction of the Castelli estate. The family compound, Salvatore's center of power, it was undergoing liquidation. Eels. Assets were seized, property sold, every component systematically dismantled. How does it feel? Lena inquired. Victor surveyed the locus of his entire conditioning. Vacant but also unburdened. What is our next move? Whatever we desire. Eels. He turned to her. The contract is nullified. Eels. It has been since my status as heir was revoked. You are free. Take the allocated funds. Begin again. Lena exhibited a somatic stress response. Is that your desired outcome? My desire is for you to have a choice. Not an obligation, not an entrapment. Eels. A genuine choice. And if my choice is to remain? Victor's respiration hitched. Then the remainder of my life would be dedicated to ensuring you never experienced regret. Lena closed the distance between them. I am not leaving, Lena. I am not leaving. Eels. Not due to the contract, not due to entrapment, but because between the strategic games, the press conferences, and the nights you provided comfort, my desire to leave dissipated. Her hand made contact with his. You asked about our dynamic. Feels. I believe we are individuals who converged under the worst possible conditions and elected to construct a superior reality together. Victor pulled her into an embrace, holding her as if she were the only stable element in his collapsed world. Feels. I am not deserving of you. That is probable. But you are, nevertheless, bound to me, he laughed. What is our next move? We begin again. Construct something new, something not founded on violence or corruption or fear. Feels. That is an ambitious objective. You wish to alter the empire. I am proposing you alter yourself instead. Evolve into something better than your conditioning. Victor looked down at her. And you will assist? At every stage. Feels. Even during periods of difficulty? Especially then. He kissed her, gentle, confident. Feels. The kind of kiss devoid of performance or strategy, simply two subjects choosing one another in the absence of obligation. When they separated, Lena smiled. So what is first? First, we marry. A legitimate marriage. Not a contract, not an arrangement. Feels. The authentic article. We are already married. That was a transaction. I require this to be real. Lena's eyes showed signs of lacrimation. Are you proposing? I am promising that if you accept me, Feels. If you accept a man who is fractured and rebuilding and far from perfect, I will spend the rest of my existence validating the choice you made. Yes, 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 you fool. The answer is obviously yes. Victor lifted her, spinning her around. Feels. And for the first time since their initial encounter, his presentation was youthful, unburdened, free. Feels. They were married 2 weeks later, a small proceeding. Only the two subjects, a judge and Mrs. Kozlov as a witness. Lena wore a simple white dress, Victor wore a suit. Feels. They recited vows of their own composition, promises that were tangible, difficult, and worth pursuing. And when the judge declared them married, when Victor kissed her, as if she were the sole point of focus, Feels. Lena experienced a sensation that had been absent for a year. Hope. The subsequent phase presented greater difficulty. Victor allocated his remaining capital to establish a foundation. Feels. It provided resources for individuals in circumstances similar to Lena's. Debt counseling, legal aid, secure housing, set strategies for those who perceived none. Lena worked with him, applying her accounting skills to manage the finances. Feels. Ensuring fiduciary responsibility. Feels. They were constructing something. Progress was slow, imperfect, but it was construction. Then, 3 months after the second wedding, Lena experienced a missed menstrual cycle. She administered 3 tests. All were positive. Feels. She sat on the bathroom floor, observing the positive indicators, and experienced a significant cognitive shift. A child. The biological imperative demanded by the contract. The very catalyst for the entire scenario. Except now, Feels. It was framed not as a contractual obligation, but as a choice. A future. Something real. She located Victor in his office. He looked up at her entry. Hey, is everything all right? Lena presented the positive test. Victor became completely still. Feels. Positive. All 3. He stood across the room to her and took the test from her with trembling hands. Feels. You are pregnant. Yes. We are having a baby. Yes. Victor looked at her, then at the test, then back at her again. I am going to be a father, a real one. Not the contractual version. Feels. The version who is present and remains and does not utilize children as strategic assets. His eyes moistened, a genuine display of tears. I lack the programming for that, as do I. But we will learn the process together. Victor pulled her into an embrace. Feels. Holding her with a pressure that restricted her breathing. I am terrified. I am as well. What if I fail at this? Then we correct the failure. That is what people do. Lena pulled back, looking at him. You are not your father, Victor. Feels. You are choosing a different path. And that choice has more significance than any other factor. You genuinely believe that? I know it. Feels. Because I witnessed you incinerate your entire known world to construct something better. And if you can do that, you can be the father this child requires. Victor pressed his forehead against hers. I love you. Feels. The words remained in the space between them, the first time he had vocalized them. Lena smiled through her tears. I love you too. Despite the fact that I'm a dysfunctional subject, especially because of it, it confirms your humanity. Feels. And humans are permitted to fail, to learn, and to attempt again. That is a highly optimistic assessment of humanity. I learned it from someone who chose redemption over an empire. So, you are responsible. Victor laughed, then kissed her. Feels. We are really proceeding with this. We are. Building a life, raising a child, the complete protocol. The complete protocol. Together. Feels. The subjects integrated their lives. The child, a female designated Anna, was born 7 months later. The infant presented as healthy, a viable biological outcome that would serve as a powerful anchor for the relationship. Heals. In the clinical setting of the hospital room, Lena exhibited signs of profound maternal bonding, an overwhelming oxytocin-fueled response. Victor, the paternal subject, displayed a fixation on the child. Heals. A reaction consistent with a megalomaniac narcissist confronting a biological reality he cannot control but has created. His anxieties, what if I drop her? What if she hates me? Were classic projections of inadequacy. Heals. Lena's response served to regulate his anxiety, reinforcing her role as the primary emotional caretaker and solidifying the triad's initial structure. Heals. The infant's palmar grasp reflex, a primitive neurological response, triggered a significant emotional reaction in the father. Heals. His verbal commitment, I promise I'm going to do better than mine did, signals a conscious effort to sever a pattern of familial trauma. Lena's physiological reaction, a tightening of the throat, heals, indicates her own recognition of this critical psychological moment. Their prolonged stasis as a unit demonstrates the formation of a powerful insular bond, evolving a transactional arrangement into a deeply enmeshed familial system. Heals. The arrival of Lena's mother 1 year later introduced an external variable. The new residence, described as warmer, symbolizes a shift from a defensive fortress to a normative domestic environment. The mother's inquiry, "You did all this?" Heals, was a test of the new power dynamic. Heals, "I don't know if I should thank you or hate you." A textbook articulation of cognitive dissonance. Victor's reply, "Both is fair," is a calculated admission of culpability. Heals, a sophisticated tactic to neutralize historical aggression while asserting control over the present narrative. He reframes the outcome as a success. The mother's correction, "I'm grateful. There's a difference," Heals, reveals her struggle to reconcile her daughter's apparent well-being with the coercive origins of the relationship. Lena assumes the role of mediator, managing the emotional states of the other two subjects. Heals. The gathering of 3 generations represents a complex system of intergenerational trauma now entering a tentative reparative phase. Later, in a private setting, the core dyad proceeds to analyze their history. Heals. Do you ever regret it? Victor initiates a probe into the stability of their bond. Lena's negative response is a key indicator of Stockholm Syndrome. Heals, in which the victim reframes their traumatic experience as a necessary catalyst for a positive outcome. She has fully integrated the narrative that her survival and current happiness were contingent on the initial captivity. Her statement, Heals, especially because it was terrifying, is a classic romanticization of trauma. Victor's acknowledgement, "I was supposed to be your captor," serves as a verbal confirmation of the original power dynamic, Heals, which has since metamorphosed into a complex codependency where the roles of captor and caregiver have become indistinguishably blurred. Heals. Lena's rationalization of their history represents a constructed narrative designed to restore a sense of agency. The moral is that nothing is permanent except the choices we make. This is a powerful cognitive reframing. Heals. She posits that both parties made conscious, voluntary choices to alter their predestined paths, thereby validating the relationship's legitimacy. He could have remained the sociopathic archetype his father cultivated. She could have fled. Heals. Their decision not to represents the choice that underpins their shared reality. Victor's quiet acceptance of this moral framework signifies his complete assimilation into this new psychological paradigm, cementing the stability of their unit. Heals. The foundation they established, a form of sublimation, channels their experiences into a socially acceptable pro-social enterprise. Heals. The mother's sobriety and Victor's resumption of playing music are further evidence of a successful construction of a stable, normative lifestyle. Their conflicts are not eliminated but managed. Heals. A sign that the underlying pathologies persist beneath the functional surface. The central thesis of their bond remains this continuous daily choice. It is a constant cognitive exercise to reinforce their commitment over other, Heals, less complicated options. This active, ongoing decision-making process is the primary mechanism that sustains their highly unorthodox relationship. Heals. Lena expresses gratitude for Victor's change, reinforcing his reformed identity. His response, thanking her for seeing someone worth saving, Heals, validates her role as the agent of his redemption, a clear manifestation of a symbiotic savior and saved dynamic. This exchange is critical for their mutual psychological stability. Heals. Her self-identification as stubborn enough confirm her acceptance of this role. Their eventual physiological synchrony, down to their breathing, is an objective signifier of deep, long-term enmeshment. Heals. The closing of the day does not merely mark the end of a routine, but a successful reaffirmation of their constructed reality. Heals. In summary, the subject's relationship initiated as a textbook case of captor and captive, a dynamic defined by coercion and transaction. The initial pathology was clear. Over time, however, heals. It transformed into a functional partnership that has not only endured but produced a legacy of healing in their own narrative. They have successfully repurposed the wreckage of their past. Heals. By consciously choosing to build a new identity from the remnants of their trauma, they achieved a stable psychological equilibrium. In the final analysis, this outcome, while born from pathological circumstances, heals, represents a complete and functional adaptation. For them, it is everything.